On a humid afternoon in Travis County, Texas, the courtroom doors opened and a quiet 16-year-old boy walked inside. His name was Caleb Thornton. He looked exactly like the kind of teenager people trusted. Clean-cut hair, parted neatly to one side, a pressed collared shirt, soft eyes that moved around the room and then settled on the table in front of him with an expression of quiet grief. Throughout the trial, Caleb sat calmly beside his attorney, occasionally wiping away tears and apologizing to the victim's family in a voice barely above a whisper. According to him, the tragedy had been a terrible accident. Two teenagers arguing, a push, a fall, and suddenly one of them was dead. The defense insisted Caleb never meant for anyone to get hurt. Just a good kid caught in a horrible moment, they said. Just a boy overwhelmed by circumstances that spiraled beyond his control. But investigators had discovered something Caleb Thornton did not know about. A camera, mounted above a nearby parking garage aimed at the lot below. It had recorded everything. Every second of the confrontation, every deliberate movement that followed. And when the jury finally saw what that camera captured, the story of a tragic accident would disappear completely. By the time Judge Daniela Vargas addressed Caleb Thornton for the final time, the image of the sweet, innocent boy would be gone forever. The victim's name was Ryan Castillo. He was 16 years old, a sophomore at the same high school as Caleb, and by all accounts, a teenager in the middle of the ordinary chaos of being 16. He played bass guitar, badly, and knew it. He worked weekend shifts at a taco stand near his house to save money for a used car. His friends described him as loud and funny and occasionally annoying, in the specific way that people who say exactly what they are thinking are sometimes annoying. He and Caleb had known each other since middle school, and the friendship had deteriorated over the course of the previous year into something that involved deleted posts and blocked numbers, and the kind of slow-building hostility that lives inside phone screens and surfaces without warning. On the last night of Ryan Castillo's life, he received a call from Caleb Thornton, asking him to come to the parking lot behind the Riverside Commons shopping center on East Altorf Street. Ryan told his older sister he was going to meet someone and he would be back in an hour. He did not come back. His body was discovered at 11:47 that evening by a couple walking through the parking lot to their car. He was lying at an angle near the raised curb at the edge of the lot, in a position that the first responding officer described in his incident report as consistent with a fall. There was blood on the pavement. There was no one else in the lot when the couple found him. Caleb Thornton was at home when the police arrived. He came to the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his expression arranging itself quickly into one of confusion and then distress as the officers explained why they were there. He said he had not seen Ryan. He said he had been home all evening. He said he did not know anything about any meeting at any parking lot. Detective Lena Carver, who caught the case on night shift rotation, noted Caleb's demeanor during that initial doorway conversation in her casebook. She wrote 3 words: composed, rehearsed, aware. These were not words she used randomly. She had been a detective with the Travis County Sheriff's Office for 9 years, and she had developed specific language for specific patterns of behavior. Composed meant the person was controlling their presentation deliberately. Rehearsed meant the answers came slightly too smoothly for someone who had just been told a classmate was dead. Aware meant the person understood they were being watched and was performing accordingly.
She left a deputy at the Thornton residence and went back to the crime scene. The scene had been photographed and processed by the time she returned. The medical examiner's initial assessment, which she received as a field report before the full autopsy, described the victim's injuries as inconsistent with a single impact fall. Ryan Castillo had suffered multiple blunt force impacts to his skull and neck at varying angles, in a pattern that was more consistent with a sustained assault than with hitting the pavement once. Carver read this in the parking lot, standing under reportable light the crime scene unit had set up, with the sounds of traffic on Oltorf Street behind her and the taped-off area in front of her. She looked at the position of the body. She looked at the curb. She thought about the word inconsistent and everything it meant for the direction of the case. Then she looked up at the buildings surrounding the parking lot and began counting cameras. The parking garage on the west side of Riverside Commons was a 4-level structure owned by a commercial property management company. It had 8 exterior cameras covering the ramp entrances, the street-level lot, and the pedestrian walkways. The camera on the southwest corner of the first level was positioned to cover the approach to the parking garage entrance from the street, and its field of view included a portion of the adjacent lot where Ryan Castillo's body had been found. Carver requested the footage from the property management company the following morning. They provided access within 4 hours. She sat in a conference room at the property management office with a laptop and a member of the building's security staff and watched 12 hours of footage from that camera at 4 times speed, starting from 6 in the evening and running through midnight. She was nearly at the end of the window when she saw it. She stopped the playback. She rewound 30 seconds. She hit play at normal speed. She watched for 97 seconds without moving. Then she set her notepad on the table beside the laptop and looked at what she had written, though she had not been aware of writing anything. She had written, deliberate, sustained, staged. She closed the laptop gently, asked the security staff member to please ensure the footage was preserved and not accessed by anyone else pending a formal evidence request, and called her lieutenant from the parking lot. Her lieutenant listened without speaking. When she finished describing what she had seen, he said, "How clear is the face identification?" "Multiple frames," she said. "Full frontal at one point. The lighting is excellent." "Send me the timestamp markers and I'll meet you at the station," he said. She drove back with the windows down despite the cold, letting the night air keep her awake and focused. She had been a detective long enough to know that the cases which resolved cleanly were not necessarily the cases that felt clean. What she had seen on that footage was the answer to every question in the file. But the answer was not a relief. It was a 16-year-old boy standing over another 16-year-old boy in a parking lot at night, doing something that could not be undone, and then trying to make it look like something else. What she had seen on that footage was not a fall. What she had seen was not an accident. What she had seen was a deliberate, sustained, calculated assault, followed by a deliberate, staged arrangement of a body, performed by a person whose face was clearly visible at multiple points during the sequence. She had recognized that face from the doorway conversation the previous night. The composed, rehearsed, aware boy in the sweatpants and the t-shirt. The warrant for Caleb Thornton's arrest was signed by a magistrate judge the following morning. Carver and 2 uniformed deputies drove to the Thornton house at 7:30 in the grey light hour before the school day started. Caleb answered the door himself, and she watched his face as he saw the badges and understood what was happening. Something moved across his expression very quickly, something that was not fear and not surprise, but something more like the recognition of a scenario that had been imagined and prepared for. Then grief came over it, like a curtain being pulled across a window, and he said softly, "Okay," in a voice that sounded like someone accepting a terrible injustice with dignity. She noted, "Performs immediately." Caleb's parents called an attorney from the driveway. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Morse, who had a practice in downtown Austin and a reputation for skillful work in serious juvenile cases, arrived at the station within the hour. She spoke with Caleb in a consultation room for 40 minutes before allowing any questioning. When questioning began, Caleb was precise and composed. He maintained the story he had told at the door. He had been home. He had not seen Ryan. He was devastated. He did not understand why he was being accused of something so terrible. Morse listened and occasionally interjected to rephrase questions or limit the scope of answers. She was watching Caleb as much as the detectives were, and what she was watching was a client who was performing extremely well, and whose performance was going to meet a very specific obstacle that she had not yet been shown. When Carver informed Morse that the state had video evidence from a parking garage camera covering the scene, she watched Morse's expression rather than Caleb's. Morse was professional and did not react visibly, but in the slight adjustment of her posture, in the way her eyes moved to her client and then back to Carver without expression, Carver read the recognition. Morse now knew what she was working with. The arraignment was held in juvenile court 2 weeks after the arrest. Caleb walked into the courtroom in a collared shirt and khaki pants, his hair combed, his face composed into an expression of quiet sorrow. He was 16, and he looked younger than 16, in the way that some people do, with a face that had not yet settled into its adult proportions. He sat beside Morse at the defense table and folded his hands on the surface in front of him, and looked down with the stillness of someone bearing an unbearable weight. When the court asked him to enter his plea, he stood and said, "Not guilty," in a voice that broke slightly on the second word. He steadied himself. He looked at the judge with eyes that were wet but not overflowing. The eyes of someone struggling to maintain composure under tremendous pressure. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Caleb's mother, seated in the front row, pressed a hand over her mouth. The prosecutor, a man named David Achebe, who had been with the Travis County District Attorney's Office for 8 years and had developed a particular patience for cases that required careful sequencing, let Morse make her initial statement without comment. The defense position was exactly what anyone familiar with the evidence would have predicted. A tragic argument, an accidental fall, a terrible outcome that no one, least of all Caleb, had intended. A good boy from a good family who would carry the weight of this tragedy for the rest of his life and deserved the court's compassion. Achebe said, when his turn came, that the state intended to present video evidence directly contradicting the defense's characterization of events. He said it once, quietly, and sat down. In the weeks between the arraignment and the trial, Patricia Morse visited Caleb at the juvenile detention facility 7 times. She brought legal pads and coffee and spent long hours going over the case with a precision that Caleb found reassuring. He believed in her. He believed in his own performance. He had been performing his entire life in the specific way that people who have learned early that image is a form of protection learn to perform, and he was good at it. During the first consultation, Morse had laid out the case structure with complete candor. She explained the medical examiner's findings. She explained the phone records. She explained the social media history and what the prosecution intended to do with it. She explained that one of Caleb's classmates had been interviewed and had described a specific conversation from the afternoon of the incident. Caleb had listened to all of it with his characteristic composure, occasionally asking a question that was careful and targeted. He asked about the classmate. He asked whether the classmate could be discredited. He asked about the forensic interpretation of the injuries and whether it could be challenged by a defense expert. He was thinking tactically, working through the trial the way a person works through a puzzle, looking for the piece that would make the picture solvable. Morse answered each question honestly. Then she said, "The video is the problem." Caleb looked at her. "I know. I need you to tell me exactly what is on that video." Caleb told her what was on the video. He told her in the same tone he used for everything, calm and measured and slightly sad. He told her that it would look bad out of context. He told her that what it showed was not what it seemed. He told her that he had panicked after Ryan fell, and his actions after the fact were the actions of a frightened teenager, not a person trying to cover up a crime. Morse listened to all of it. Then she said, "Caleb, I need to be very clear with you. Whatever is on that video, the jury is going to see it. And they are going to see it after hearing everything else the prosecution presents. The forensic evidence, the phone records, the witnesses. By the time they see the video, they will already have a framework for understanding it."
My job is to build a competing framework, but I need your complete honesty about what that footage shows so I can do that job. Caleb looked at her with those composed, wet eyes. "I panicked," he said. "I know it looks bad, but I panicked." "Caleb." Morse set her pen down. "I have watched the footage. I watched it twice in the Discovery Review. I need you to understand that the word panic does not describe what is visible in that recording. What is visible in that recording is a sequence of actions that are deliberate and systematic. The prosecution is going to describe each action in sequence, step by step, and the jury is going to watch those actions on a large screen, and they are going to have to reconcile those actions with the word panic." She folded her hands on the table between them. "I can argue adrenaline. I can argue a dissociative state. I can argue that you were in shock and your actions were not rational. But I cannot argue panic in the face of footage that shows someone looking around the lot and adjusting the position of a body. That is not panic. That is decision-making." Something moved across Caleb's face then, something that was briefly not composed, something closer to the face underneath the performance. It lasted only a moment. Then the composure returned. "Then argue the dissociative state," he said. Morse wrote something on her legal pad. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had now seen the footage herself through the discovery process, and that Caleb's account of his own behavior did not match what was recorded in any way she could credibly argue in front of 12 jurors. She was going to try. That was her obligation, and she believed in it. But she was already thinking about sentencing mitigation, because that was where this case was going to be decided. The trial began on a Tuesday in early October, the air in the courthouse still carrying the tail end of a Texas summer, the kind of heat that lingers in the corridors and makes people slightly irritable in ways they cannot locate. The courtroom for the adult trial, to which the case had been transferred following the prosecution's motion citing the severity of the offense, was large and wood-paneled, and smelled of old furniture and climate control. Caleb sat at the defense table in a navy blazer that his mother had brought from home, his hands folded on the surface in front of him. He looked like a private school student who had been brought to court for an administrative hearing. The jury selection had produced a panel that Achebe felt modestly comfortable with. 12 people who had varied backgrounds and who had answered the voir dire questions about juvenile defendants and video evidence with responses that suggested they were willing to evaluate both. Morse had challenged several jurors who she believed would be too easily influenced by security footage. The ones who remained were people who described themselves as fair and analytical, which was, in Achebe's experience, almost exactly what a prosecutor wanted. The opening statements set the battle lines clearly. Achebe described the case methodically, starting with Ryan Castillo as a person and ending with the video evidence as the definitive record of what had happened. He was measured and factual. He did not dramatize. He let the facts carry the weight because he had learned that facts, presented clearly and in sequence, were more persuasive than rhetoric. Morse's opening statement was longer and more emotionally textured. She described Caleb's background. She described his academic record, his relationships, his history. She described him as a young person who had made a terrible error in judgment during a moment of fear and adrenaline, and who deserved to be judged as a whole person, rather than by a few seconds of footage stripped of context. She used the word context 14 times in 20 minutes. She knew what was coming, and she was trying to build a word around it before it arrived. The prosecution's first witnesses were foundational. The first responding officer described the scene in technical, precise terms. The medical examiner who had performed Ryan Castillo's autopsy took the stand the following morning and spent 2 hours describing her findings. She was a precise, unhurried woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who had performed over 300 autopsies in her career, and who gave testimony with the confidence of someone who has no stake in the outcome and simply intends to describe what is true. Dr. Nair, Achebe said, based on your findings, is Ryan Castillo's cause of death consistent with a single fall onto a hard surface? No, she said. The injury pattern is inconsistent with a single impact fall. Ryan Castillo suffered 4 distinct blunt force impacts to his skull and posterior neck. 2 of those impacts were delivered at a downward angle, consistent with a person standing above him while he was already on the ground. A fall from a standing position does not produce downward angle impacts to the posterior skull. Those injuries require a secondary force applied after the person is no longer standing. In plain terms, Achebe said, someone struck him while he was already down. Yes, the medical evidence is consistent with that conclusion. Morse's cross-examination challenged the certainty of Dr. Nair's angular assessments. She asked whether impact angle could be precisely determined from wound characteristics. Dr. Nair acknowledged that forensic pathology involved inference as well as direct observation, but maintained that the pattern of injuries in this case was strongly inconsistent with a single fall explanation. Morse asked whether an unusual fall, such as a person falling against a curb edge or in a spinning motion, could produce multiple impact points. Dr.
Nair said such a scenario was theoretically possible, but would require highly specific circumstances that were not supported by the scene evidence. The location of the injuries, she explained, required the person to be stationary and facing downward when the final impacts were delivered. Morse sat down. She had made small points. They were not enough points. Detective Lena Carver took the stand on the third day. She was a compact, direct woman in her early 40s who answered questions without elaboration and elaborated when asked without any visible anxiety about where the questions were going. She described the initial investigation, the crime scene, the decision to seek camera footage from surrounding buildings, and the process of reviewing the parking garage footage. She described what she had observed on that footage without yet displaying it to the court, providing the jury with a verbal preview that was careful and factual. "When you first viewed the footage," Achebe said, "what was your assessment of what it showed?" "It showed a deliberate physical assault," Carver said. "It showed the victim being struck from behind, falling, and then being struck again while on the ground. It showed the defendant positioning the body near the curb after the assault concluded. It did not show an accident." Morse objected to the characterization, and the judge sustained the objection on the final word, instructing the jury to disregard Carver's personal conclusion. But the description itself had been heard. The jury had the picture now. The video would fill it in. Morse's cross-examination of Carver was the defense's most extended effort of the trial. She asked Carver about the initial investigation, specifically whether law enforcement had formed a theory of the crime before reviewing the footage. Carver said no, that the initial incident report had characterized the death as a possible accident, consistent with the scene evidence at first observation, and that the medical examiner's preliminary report had prompted the camera search. "So you went looking for footage that would support a murder theory," Morse said. "I went looking for footage that would tell me what happened," Carver said evenly. "What the footage showed determined the theory, not the other way round." Morse asked whether Carver had any bias toward Caleb Thornton before viewing the footage. Carver acknowledged that Caleb's initial demeanor during the doorway conversation had struck her as unusual and had been noted in her casebook. Morse asked whether it was appropriate to note a teenager's composure as suspicious when that teenager was being told a classmate had died. Carver said that noting behavioral observations was standard investigative practice, and that her notes described behavior rather than character. She said she had recorded her observations and then gone to find objective evidence. "And the objective evidence was the footage," Morse said. "Yes. And the footage is, in your opinion, unambiguous." "In my opinion, it is very clear." Morse sat down. She had done what she could, but the jury had heard Carver describe the footage 3 times now, and each description was more specific than the last. They were ready for the footage itself. Caleb watched Carver step down from the stand with his customary composed expression. In his mind, he was still calculating. He was still looking for the angle. He told himself that the footage, while damaging, could be argued in context. He had seen cases on the internet where surveillance footage looked terrible, and defendants had still prevailed. He told himself he was a teenager, and teenagers received leniency. He told himself Patricia Morse was skilled, and had said she would build a framework. He told himself many things as Carver walked past him and the next witness was called. He was very good at telling himself what he needed to hear. The phone records came in through a carrier analyst who explained the call and message log between Caleb Thornton and Ryan Castile in the 24 hours before Ryan's death. There had been 7 outgoing calls from Caleb's number to Ryan's number over the course of that day. 4 of the calls had gone unanswered. Ryan had finally picked up the 7th call at 8:43 in the evening. The call had lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Ryan's last outgoing text message, sent to his older sister at 9:11 that evening, said he was going to meet someone and would be back in an hour. Ryan had arrived at the parking lot at approximately 9:24, based on the parking garage camera timestamp. A classmate named Dominic Torres testified that during lunch the day of the incident, Caleb had told him he was going to settle things with Ryan that night. He had used that exact phrase, Torres said. Settle things. Dominic had not thought much of it at the time, because the two boys had been in a prolonged social conflict that everyone at school knew about, and people said things like that about ongoing disputes all the time. He had only connected the phrase to what happened later when detectives came to his house 3 days after Ryan's death. Was Caleb someone you would describe as an angry person? Achebe asked. Dominic thought for a moment. Not exactly angry. He was more like, when things bothered him, he held on to them. He didn't let things go. The situation with Ryan had been going on for months, and every time it seemed like it would die down, Caleb would bring it back up. Did he seem afraid of Ryan? No, Dominic said. Not at all. He seemed annoyed, like Ryan was a problem he needed to deal with. Morse cross-examined Dominic carefully, suggesting that the phrase settle things was a common expression that could mean any number of things, from a fistfight to a simple conversation. Dominic agreed that it was a common expression. He maintained that Caleb had said it with a specific tone that he had remembered. Morse pressed him on whether tone could be accurately recalled after several days. Dominic said he remembered the tone because of what happened that night, and because it was the last conversation he could specifically recall having with Caleb before Ryan died. He said that when the detectives came to his house, the conversation at lunch had come back to him immediately, without prompting, because it suddenly meant something different than it had at the time. Caleb sat at the defense table during Dominic's testimony and watched his former classmate with an expression of hurt bewilderment, the expression of someone who cannot believe a friend would describe them this way. Morse noticed the expression and noted that it was effective. The juror with the notepad in the second row was looking at Caleb rather than at the witness, watching the expression and writing. The social media evidence came in through a forensic analyst who had examined both boys' accounts and the message threads between them. The history was extensive. It had begun 8 months earlier with an online argument that had started in the comments of a shared post and escalated through direct messages into a sustained exchange of insults and escalating threats. Several of Caleb's messages included language that Achebe read aloud in the courtroom in a flat, deliberate tone that made the words land heavily. One message, sent 11 days before Ryan's death, read, "This isn't over. You don't know what I'm capable of." Another, sent 3 days before the incident, read, "We need to handle this in person. You've been hiding online long enough." Caleb sat at the defense table and looked down at the table as these messages were read. He had the expression of someone listening to something they deeply regretted, which was a useful expression, but not, given the context, a fully adequate one. On the 5th day of testimony, a digital forensics specialist named Raymond Chu took the stand to address the circumstances under which the parking garage footage had been obtained and authenticated. Chu was a thin, precise man in his mid-30s who had the particular intensity of someone who cares deeply about the integrity of data chains. He explained the formal evidence request, the download process, the file hashing procedure that verified the footage had not been altered or edited since it was transferred from the building server to the county evidence database,
and the chain of custody documentation that covered every person who had accessed the file between the moment of collection and the moment it would be played in court. "Mr. Chu," Achebe said, "is there any technical possibility that the footage we are about to present has been altered, edited, or manipulated in any way?" "No," Chu said. "The file hash value generated at the time of collection matches the hash value of the file currently in evidence. Those values are unique to the precise content of the file. If a single frame had been altered, the hash would not match. The footage is unaltered." Morse asked on cross-examination whether the original building server still existed for comparison. Chu confirmed it did, and that the comparison had been performed. Morse asked whether timestamp systems on external cameras were always reliable. Chu acknowledged that camera clocks could drift and noted that the parking garage camera's timestamp had been calibrated against network time servers, making its accuracy verifiable and verified. Morse had no further questions. The gallery had been full every day of the trial. The Castillo family sat in the third row, Ryan's father Marco in the center, his mother Elena beside him, Ryan's older sister Maya on the other side. They had come every day without exception. They sat with the stillness of people who have no energy left for anything except being present. Marco Castillo had a habit of pressing his thumb and forefinger against his nose bridge whenever the medical evidence was discussed, a gesture that seemed involuntary and private. Elena kept her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the courtroom with an expression of exhausted determination. Caleb never looked at the Castillo family. He had been advised not to, and in this one instance, he had taken the advice and followed it completely. By the time the 6th day of testimony arrived, the courtroom had developed the particular atmosphere of a place where the audience knows something is coming. The earlier days had established the foundation carefully: the medical evidence, the phone records, the social media history, the classmates' testimony, the forensic authentication of the video. Each piece had been placed deliberately, like stones across a stream. And now there was only one stone left to place. Everyone in the room knew which stone it was and where it was going. Achebe stood that morning and told the court that the state wished to present Exhibit 51. Judge Daniela Vargas, who had presided over the trial from behind the bench with a quality of precise attention that suggested she missed nothing and filed everything, noted the exhibit number and asked the courtroom technician to prepare the display system. She was a 47-year-old judge who had served on the Travis County bench for 6 years, and before that had spent 11 years as a prosecutor in the same county, working cases that ranged from fraud to homicide. She had seen manipulation in courtrooms in every form it presented itself, and she had long since stopped being surprised by it. She had been watching Caleb Thornton throughout this trial with a particular kind of attention, the attention of someone who has catalogued a performance and is waiting to see it end. She had watched him fold his hands on the table each morning with the same deliberate care. She had watched him wipe his eyes at precisely calibrated moments. She had watched him thank witnesses who described his good character with a small, humble nod. She had watched all of it carefully, and she had waited. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the display screen on the wall adjacent to the jury box activated. A video player interface appeared on the screen. The timestamp in the corner of the image read 21:24:07, which in standard notation meant 9:24 and 7 seconds in the evening. The image showed a parking lot at night,
lit by the orange-tinted overhead lights that commercial lots use. The pavement was visible. The curb at the far edge of the lot was visible. The image was clear, the resolution high enough to read a license plate at 20 yards. Before Achebe pressed play, he paused for a moment and turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "you are about to see footage that is difficult to watch. I ask you to watch it carefully and in its entirety. The footage speaks for itself. I will have no narration." Then he nodded to the technician. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had a texture to it, the quiet of collective held breath. At the 23-second mark on the recording, Ryan Castillo walked into frame from the left side of the image. He was wearing a red hoodie and jeans. He walked into the center of the lot and stopped, looking around. He was clearly waiting for someone. There was something ordinary about his posture, the looseness of a teenager standing somewhere familiar, shifting his weight slightly, glancing toward the street. He had been here before. He worked near here. This was a part of the world he knew. Several jurors watched Ryan walk into frame and then looked instinctively toward the defense table and then back at the screen. Caleb was watching the screen too. His expression was carefully maintained, the soft eyes and the grieved composure, but something in the set of his jaw had changed in a way that was barely perceptible, and then, as the seconds ticked by, became more visible. At the 41-second mark, Caleb Thornton entered the frame from the right. He was wearing a dark jacket. His face was fully visible in the parking lot lighting as he crossed the lot toward Ryan. He walked with purpose. This was not the walk of someone who was nervous or reluctant. It was a direct, deliberate stride. The stride of a person who knows where they are going and has already decided what they intend to do when they arrive. In the courtroom, the real Caleb Thornton watched himself walk toward Ryan Castillo. He watched himself approach the same way you might watch a memory that you have been trying not to revisit, with a terrible, recognizing stillness. The two boys faced each other on the screen. They spoke. The footage had no audio, so the words were not audible, but their body language was visible, and it was not the body language of a reconciliation. Ryan's posture shifted as the conversation continued. His arms crossed. His head turned slightly. He turned partially away, a movement that read as dismissal or disengagement, the body language of someone who has heard enough and is preparing to leave. The juror in the second row set down his pen. At 1 minute and 12 seconds, Caleb Thornton moved. He stepped forward and struck Ryan Castillo from behind, hitting him at the base of the skull with a closed fist. Ryan dropped immediately, his knees buckling before his body hit the pavement. The fall was not a trip or a stumble. It was the sudden, total collapse of a person who has lost consciousness or control of their body. The red hoodie crumpled against the pavement. Ryan did not move. Caleb stood over him for a moment. In the courtroom, at the defense table, the real Caleb's left hand had separated from his right and gripped the table edge. His knuckles were pale. His breathing was audible to Patricia Morse sitting beside him. On the screen, Caleb bent down and struck Ryan again. The gesture was not frantic. It was not the movement of someone in a rage spiral, someone who had lost control. It was measured, deliberate, a person completing a task. And again. Several people in the gallery made sounds. One of the Castillo family members said something that was not words.
The sound of it was raw and specific in the silent room. Elena Castillo had covered her eyes with both hands. Maya had not. Maya was watching the screen with an expression that was beyond grief, something older and harder that had no specific name. On the screen, Caleb straightened. He looked around the parking lot, scanning in both directions. He looked directly at the camera for one frame, and in that frame, his face was unmistakable and completely recognizable as the face of the boy sitting 20 feet away at the defense table. The composure on the face in the footage was exactly what made it so chilling. It was not the face of someone in shock. It was not the face of someone grappling with what they had done. It was the face of someone assessing a situation and determining next steps. Then he bent and took Ryan's body under the arms and dragged it toward the curb at the edge of the lot. He arranged the position of the body near the raised edge, placing the head near the curb in a configuration that would be consistent with a fall. He stood back and looked at the arrangement. He adjusted Ryan's arm. The adjustment was small and precise, like a person adjusting a detail that is almost right, but not quite. He stepped back again and looked once more. Then he walked out of frame. The footage froze. Achebe said, "No further questions at this time." The silence in the courtroom lasted for several seconds. Then it broke unevenly, the way silence always breaks in a room full of people who have just processed something enormous. Caleb Thornton was not silent. He had been watching the footage from the defense table with the expression of someone who does not exist. The composed grief, the soft eyes, the folded hands, all of it had simply vanished from his face, as though the footage had erased it. His mouth was open slightly. His hands, which had been folded on the table throughout the entire trial, had separated and gripped the table edge. His breathing was visible from the jury box. His face, which had performed so consistently for 6 days, was now simply the face of a 16-year-old boy who had just watched himself. His attorney, Patricia Morse, had a legal pad open in front of her and was holding a pen. She was not writing anything. She was looking at the frozen image on the screen, the image of her client standing over a body in a parking lot at night. And she was holding the pen the way a person holds something when they need to hold something, and there is nothing else available. She had seen the footage before. She had watched it twice in Discovery. But watching it in a courtroom, in a dimmed room, on a large screen, surrounded by jurors and the victim's family and the public gallery, was a different experience entirely. It stripped away the context of strategy and preparation and left only the image itself. A juror in the second row, a middle-aged man who had taken extensive notes throughout the trial, set down his pen and looked at Caleb Thornton for a long time without looking away. The woman with reading glasses in the front row of the jury box had both hands pressed flat on the wooden rail in front of her. She was not looking at the screen. She was looking at Caleb. She had been looking at Caleb for the past 97 seconds, watching his face as he watched himself, watching the performance dissolve into something unguarded and real. The next morning, Judge Daniela Vargas called the court to order for closing arguments. Achebe delivered his closing with the same measured precision he had used throughout the trial. He walked through each piece of evidence in sequence. He described the autopsy findings and what they meant about the sequence of events.
He described the phone records and what they meant about intent and planning. He described the social media messages and what they meant about the state of mind that preceded the attack. And then he directed the jury's attention back to the footage one more time, frozen on the screen at a still image he had selected. The image of Caleb's face clearly visible in the parking lot lighting at the moment he was looking around after the final blow. That is a person who has just done exactly what he intended to do, Achebe said, and is making sure no one saw him. He paused. For 6 days, you have been watching a performance. You have watched a 16-year-old present himself to this court with folded hands and a careful expression, and a voice calibrated to the frequency of remorse. You have heard the word accident used more times than I can count. You have been invited repeatedly to see a boy overwhelmed by a terrible moment. I am asking you to see something different. I am asking you to see what the evidence shows. He gestured toward the screen. 7 phone calls to bring Ryan Castillo to that parking lot. Weeks of online messages describing an unresolved conflict that needed to be handled in person. A classmate's direct recollection of Caleb saying he was going to settle things that night. A blow delivered from behind when Ryan had turned away. Additional blows delivered while Ryan was on the ground. And then the staging. The deliberate, careful staging of a scene intended to deceive the people who would eventually find Ryan Castillo's body. He looked at the jury. Those are not the actions of a person who panicked. Those are the actions of a person who planned, executed, and then tried to conceal. The evidence supports only one conclusion. Morse's closing was her best work of the trial. She was thorough and compassionate, and she argued the context she had been building toward since the opening statement. She described the social escalation between 2 teenagers, the online hostility that had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control, the physiological reality of adrenaline and fear in a confrontation, the way a moment can accelerate beyond intention. She talked about the developing adolescent brain and the science of impulse control. She described Caleb as a boy, not a calculating adult, a person whose judgment and emotional regulation were not fully formed, who had allowed a conflict to reach a point of no return without having the tools to stop it. She asked the jury to hold the full complexity of a young person's psychology against the images they had seen. She did not look at the footage, as she argued. She could not help the jury unsee it. She could only ask them to see more than it showed. She tried to give them a framework large enough to contain the footage without being destroyed by it. She was not sure she had succeeded, but she had done everything the case allowed her to do, and when she sat down, she felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has given everything and knows the outcome anyway. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. They returned on a Thursday afternoon with a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder. Caleb's expression when the verdict was read was not the expression of someone who was surprised. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for something and now had the confirmation they had been avoiding. He sat very still. He did not cry. He did not perform. He was simply present in the room in a way he had not been for the previous 6 days, without the layer of performance between himself and the facts of his situation. It was, in its own way, the most genuine version of himself that the courtroom had seen. Morse placed her hand briefly on Caleb's arm and said something quietly. He did not respond. He sat with his eyes on the table as the jury was discharged and the courtroom began the ordinary procedural activity that follows a verdict. The gallery emptied slowly. The Castillo family gathered their things without speaking. Marco Castillo did not look at Caleb as they filed out. Maya looked at him once, briefly, from the door, and then followed her parents into the corridor. Caleb watched the table. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and in those 3 weeks, the Castillo family prepared what they intended to say. Marco Castillo worked on his statement alone at the kitchen table after Elena and Maya had gone to bed. He wrote it and rewrote it, and eventually arrived at something that was honest without being theatrical, specific without being cruel, and true in the way that things are true when they cost the person saying them everything they have. He stood at the podium on the morning of the sentencing and placed his pages on the surface and looked at them for a moment without reading. Then he looked up. He talked about Ryan at age 7, learning to ride a bike in the driveway of their house on Manchaca Road, crashing twice and getting up both times with an expression that was more annoyed than hurt. He talked about Ryan at 12, discovering music and spending every weekend for a year trying to learn bass guitar, despite having no natural aptitude for it, because it was the one he wanted, and he was not going to let the absence of talent stop him. He talked about the taco stand on weekends, the way Ryan had come home smelling of oil and grease and been proud of the money he was saving. He talked about the car Ryan had been planning to buy in the spring, a 2009 Civic with 140,000 miles. Ryan had found it on an app and shown it to Marco and said he was going to make it work. He did not talk about the parking lot. He did not describe what had been done to his son. The footage had done that work, and he did not need to repeat it. He talked about Ryan as a person, with a complete and specific life that had been cut away from the world at 16 years old, not by an accident, not by a tragedy, but by a choice. He finished and returned to his seat without looking at Caleb. Then Judge Daniela Vargas turned from the paperwork in front of her and looked at the defendant. "Caleb Thornton," she said, "I want to speak to you directly, and I want you to listen carefully to every word I'm going to say." Caleb's head came up. He had been looking at the table since the sentencing hearing began, and the act of looking up seemed to cost him something. "For the duration of this trial," the judge said, "you presented this court with a performance. You sat at that table with your hands folded. You wiped your eyes at appropriate moments. You spoke softly when you were asked to speak. You apologized. You looked grieved. You did everything that the image of an innocent, remorseful teenager was supposed to look like." She paused. "And you did it well. I will give you that." Caleb's hands, resting on the table in front of him, pressed flat. "But I have been in this courtroom for 6 years, and before that in a courtroom as a prosecutor for 11 more. And one of the things that experience teaches you is the difference between a person who is sorry and the person who has decided to appear sorry. You performed sorrow, Mr. Thornton. You performed it from the moment the police came to your door, through 7 days of testimony, right up until the moment that parking garage footage appeared on that screen. And the reason I know that is because the moment that footage appeared, the performance stopped. You could not perform through what you had just seen yourself do." Caleb's jaw tightened.
You stood in front of this court and asked us to believe that Ryan Castillo's death was an accident, an argument that went wrong, a boy who slipped and fell. You used every detail of your own appearance, your age, your manner, the way you dress, the way you speak, to ask this jury to see something other than what the evidence showed. Judge Vargas's voice did not rise. It was measured and precise and completely without mercy. Not in the sense of cruelty, but in the sense of someone who has decided that imprecision would be its own form of injustice. The footage that this court viewed showed a deliberate attack on a person who was turning away from you. It showed that person being struck from behind. It showed you continuing to strike him while he was on the ground and incapable of defending himself. And it showed you attempting to arrange his body to suggest he had fallen. You did not panic, Mr. Thornton. You planned. Caleb's head dropped forward slightly. His shoulders came in. You called Ryan Castillo 7 times to bring him to that location. You had been sending him messages for weeks about settling things in person. You told a classmate at lunch on the day of Ryan's death that you were going to settle things that night. You arrived at that parking lot not out of fear, not out of confusion, not out of the kind of momentary emotional failure that a person might understand and have compassion for, but with a specific intention that you carried out and then attempted to conceal. The judge paused, and the pause had weight. You were 16 years old when you did this. The court has considered that fact carefully. It does not change what you did. It changes the context in which you did it. But it does not change the nature of the act, the deliberateness of the act, or the permanence of its consequence for the family that is sitting in this courtroom behind you. She looked down at her papers and then back up. Ryan Castillo was 16 years old. He was saving money for a car. He was learning to play bass guitar. He had a sister who came to this courthouse every single day of this trial. He had a father who stood at that podium 20 minutes ago and described his son to this court in specific, loving, human detail. Not to manipulate anyone, but because his son was a specific, human person who deserved to be described that way. Her voice remained level. That person is gone. And he is gone because you chose to end his life and then chose to lie about it. She picked up the sentencing paperwork. I want to address the question of your image one final time, she said. You spent this trial believing that the way you looked and the way you spoke and the way you arranged your expression would be sufficient to create doubt in the minds of 12 people. You believed the performance would hold. It did not hold, because the truth was recorded, and once the truth was recorded, no performance could survive contact with it. The parking garage camera did not have an opinion of you. It did not make a judgment about your character. It simply recorded what happened. She set the paperwork down for a moment. And what happened is in the permanent record of this court and cannot be changed. She picked the paperwork back up. Caleb Thornton, it is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for a term of 30 years, to be served in state prison. This sentence reflects the deliberate nature of the crime,
the evidence of premeditation, the attempt to obstruct justice by staging the scene, and the impact of this loss on a family who will carry it for the rest of their lives. She paused once more. In this courtroom, the truth matters more than appearances. You spent a week asking this court to weigh your appearance against the truth. The court has decided, as it was always going to decide. Caleb Thornton was escorted from the defense table by 2 deputies. He walked toward the side door with his head still slightly down, the navy blazer that his mother had brought from home, now a costume from a performance that was over. His mother made a sound from the gallery, a single compressed sound that contained everything it needed to contain. Caleb did not look back at her. He walked through the door, and the door closed. The display screen on the wall adjacent to the jury box had not been cleared. The frozen, still image from the parking garage footage remained on the screen. The orange-lit parking lot, the precise timestamp in the corner, and the figure at the edge of the frame. The figure's face was turned slightly toward the camera in the captured moment, clearly visible in the parking lot lighting. The face of a boy who had believed that no one was watching. Marco Castillo looked at the screen. Then he looked at the door through which Caleb Thornton had been taken. Then he looked at his hands, pressed together in his lap. Elena put her arm around him. Maya leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat there for a moment in the emptying courtroom, while the clerk began gathering documents and the technician prepared to close the display system. The case was discussed in subsequent months in educational settings and in conversations among law enforcement professionals. It was cited in articles about surveillance infrastructure in urban commercial spaces and about the particular vulnerability of planned crimes to video documentation. Defense attorneys used it as a reminder that digital and video evidence required thorough examination during discovery. Prosecutors used it as an example of how video evidence, when properly authenticated and contextually supported by other evidence,
Could resolve factual disputes that no amount of testimony could settle. Detective Lena Carver was asked by a colleague months later what she remembered most about the case. She thought about the question for a moment before answering. She said she remembered walking out of the property management conference room and standing in the parking lot with the phone in her hand before calling her lieutenant. She remembered looking up at the building and thinking about the camera mounted on its corner, pointed down at the world with complete indifference, recording what was there to be recorded. She said she thought about the fact that Caleb Thornton had stood in the adjacent parking lot and at one point looked directly at the camera and had then proceeded with what he was doing. She said she thought about what that meant, about how he understood the world. The assumption that because something was deleted from a screen, it was gone. The assumption that because a camera existed did not mean anyone would look at what it recorded. She said the assumption of invisibility was the central mistake. People believed they were invisible until the moment they discovered they were not. A school counselor at the high school both boys had attended was quoted in a local newspaper article, saying that the case had opened conversations among students about online conflict and the way hostility escalates in digital spaces. She said students were talking about it differently than she had expected. They were not talking about the verdict. They were talking about the 8 months of messages, the incremental escalation, the question of at what point someone might have intervened. She said
She found that hopeful. None of those discussions returned Ryan Castillo to his family or the car he had been saving for, or the Sunday mornings that still existed somewhere in Maya Castillo's memory. None of them changed the contents of the parking lot on East Altorf Street on a Tuesday night in October,
or the timestamp at the corner of a parking garage camera that had been recording without expectation of what it would eventually document. The technician cleared the display screen. The parking lot image vanished. The courtroom was just a courtroom again, wood-paneled and climate-controlled, ready for whatever case came next, carrying no visible record of the week that had just concluded, except for the notes in the clerk's transcript and the paperwork filed under case number CR-04471-TX, and the particular, permanent silence of a room where something true had finally been said and could not be unsaid.